The air in my cramped apartment tasted of stale coffee and desperation. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that dared to pierce the grimy window pane, illuminating the mountain of bills on my desk. Each one was a tiny, paper-thin accusation, a testament to my dwindling resources. Rent was overdue, the landlord's voice growing increasingly strained with each unanswered call. My freelance work had dried up, leaving me with only the hollow echo of my own ambition. I'd spent weeks poring over discarded manuscripts, chasing phantom leads, and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach was becoming a permanent resident. Then the letter arrived, thick cream-colored, embossed with a crest I didn't recognize. It spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt Isolde whom I'd never met. Her solicitor, a Mr. Abernathy, informed me in precise, almost chillingly formal language that I was her sole heir. The inheritance wasn't a simple sum of money, it was a property. A sprawling estate, described vaguely as Blackwood Manor, nestled deep in the countryside, far from the city's suffocating embrace. The will, attached, was a labyrinth of archaic clauses and baffling stipulations, but one phrase shimmered with an almost unholy promise. Upon fulfillment of certain conditions, the full extent of my considerable fortune shall be made manifest. Considerable fortune. The words felt alien on my tongue, a foreign concept in my meager existence. The journey to Blackwood Manor was long, each mile stripping away another layer of the familiar world. The tarmac gave way to a rutted dirt track, swallowed by an encroaching emerald gloom. My beat-up sedan groaned in protest, its tires crunching over gravel and fallen leaves. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old blood, and then I saw it. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just dilapidated, it was a skeletal ruin clawing at the bruised twilight sky. Turrets sagged like broken teeth, windows were vacant, black eyes staring out from a weathered face of stone. A wrought iron gate, rusted and twisted, stood ajar, an invitation or a warning, I couldn't tell. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures, just the sigh of the wind through skeletal branches. Mr. Abernathy, a man as grey and unyielding as the manor's stone, met me at the gate. His voice was a dry rasp. "Welcome, Mr. Raj. The conditions are laid out in the will. I must reside here for 1 year, uninterrupted. No visitors beyond a weekly provision delivery. Any deviation and the inheritance is forfeit. My access to the outside world will be managed, of course." He gestured vaguely towards a thick, gnarled oak that seemed to lean conspiratorially over the drive. Internet, they tend to be unreliable out here. Best to embrace the solitude. Solitude, the word felt like a trap. The heavy oak door of the manor creaked open before I touched it, revealing a cavernous hall cloaked in perpetual twilight. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the marble floor. The name felt small, insignificant in this vast, decaying monument. This wasn't just an inheritance, it felt like a sentence, a place that had been waiting for me. I'd explored only a fraction of its labyrinthine corridors. Each room was a tableau of decay, draped in cobwebs, furniture shrouded in white sheets like spectral mourners. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and something else, something musky and unsettling like old fur. I found myself standing before a door, identical to the one I'd just passed and the one before that. I tried to recall how many doors I had passed. The memory felt slippery, like trying to grasp water. I felt a disorienting sense of repetition, a creeping unease that made my skin prickle. Had I been here before? Was this a different corridor? The thought was absurd, yet it lodged itself in my mind, a tiny splinter of fear. The doors stretched on, a seemingly endless procession, all precisely the same. Was I truly alone in this place, or was the house itself playing tricks on my mind? The key felt heavy in my pocket, a solid anchor in the shifting uncertainty of this place. Raj, that's what the lawyer had called me. Raj, the sole inheritor of Blackwood Manor. The sheer absurdity of it still clung to me, a fine mist I couldn't quite shake. My distant relative, a name I'd only seen on faded documents, had left me this mausoleum. The will, however, spoke of a fortune, a staggering sum that dwarfed any rational explanation for my sudden inheritance. It was the lure of that wealth, the promise of a future free from the gnawing anxieties of my current life, that had propelled me here, past the rusted gates and the suffocating silence. The air inside the manor was thick, not just with the scent of decay, but with something else. Something cloying, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, yet tinged with the metallic tang of old blood. I dismissed the creaking doors and groaning timbers as the natural complaints of a structure that had weathered centuries. The shadows, I told myself, were merely tricks of the failing light filtering through grimy, leaded panes. I spent the first few days in a whirlwind of pragmatic tasks, inventorying the dusty furniture, cataloging the cobweb-draped portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me, and attempting to coax a reluctant flame from the ancient hearth. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. Room after room, each one a monument to forgotten lives, filled with the ghosts of possessions and memories. Right, this must be the library, I'd mutter, my voice swallowed by the vastness. More books than I could read in a lifetime. It was in the library, a cavernous space lined with shelves that climbed to a ceiling lost in gloom, that the first truly unsettling incident occurred. I was sifting through a pile of brittle, leather-bound journals, their pages filled with elegant, spidery script, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching. At first, I attributed it to a rodent, a common enough annoyance in a house this old. But the sound was too deliberate, too patient. It seemed to emanate from behind one of the towering bookshelves. I moved closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick, threadbare rug. The scratching stopped. Silence descended heavier than before. Nothing, just the faint hum of my own blood in my ears. I shook my head, a nervous laugh bubbling up. Getting jumpy, Raj, I chided myself. It's just the house settling. I turned back to the journals, my fingers tracing the faded ink. Then it happened again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from behind the shelf. It was coming from within it. My gaze snapped to the rows of books. They were old, their spines cracked and faded, but they were books nonetheless. What could be scratching from inside a solid shelf? It resisted, stuck fast. I tugged harder. With a groan of protesting wood, the book came free. But it wasn't a book. It was a cleverly disguised panel, recessed into the shelf. The scratching had stopped the moment I touched the panel. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried leaves, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Its beak was pointed, and its tiny obsidian eyes seemed to gleam with a malevolent intelligence. It was the craftsmanship that unnerved me. Too perfect, too lifelike, and the cavity. It looked as if it had been designed specifically for this object. I reached in to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the rough texture of the dried leaves. They crumbled to dust at my touch, a fine gray powder that settled on my skin. It was too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably a taunt. I turned the bird over in my hand. There was no mechanism, no way for it to have made that scratching sound, yet it had. I placed it on a nearby table, my eyes still fixed on it. Later that evening, as I sat by the dying embers of the fire, the image of the wooden bird kept replaying in my mind. The scratching, I told myself it was an elaborate prank, a hidden mechanism left by my eccentric relative. It felt like more than just a clever toy. It felt like a message. I decided to explore the upper floors the next day to see if I could find any more clues, any more hidden compartments. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step a drawn-out lament. I found myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. They were all identical. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. I kept counting, my steps faltering. 10, 11, 12. The hallway stretched on, the doors repeating in an endless, maddening procession. It was as if I had stepped into a warped reflection of itself, a place where architecture itself seemed to mark my sense of direction. I reached out and tried the nearest doorknob. It turned, but the door opened onto the same hallway, the same identical doors stretching into the distance. I spun around, my eyes wide, scanning the seemingly infinite corridor. I tried another door, then another. Each time the same result, a sickening lurch in my stomach. Was I trapped? Was this some kind of illusion? I could feel my breath catching in my throat, each inhale a struggle. Had I walked into a trap? A maze designed not to keep me out, but to keep me in? The sound was there, then it wasn't. A soft, insistent tap, 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 like a fingernail against wood. I froze, the musty scent of decaying paper filling my lungs. My eyes scanned the shadowed alcoves of the library, the towering shelves that seemed to lean inward, breathing secrets. Nothing, just the settling groans of the old house, the wind whispering through unseen cracks. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. This place was getting to me. I tried to focus on the journal in my hands, the faded ink detailing a life I knew nothing about, yet felt increasingly connected to. I spent the next few days trying to impose order on the chaos. I started clearing out the dust-choked rooms, wrestling with heavy draped furniture that felt like shrouded figures. The silence was the worst. It pressed in, amplifying the creak of my own footsteps, the ragged sound of my breathing. I'd find myself holding my breath, straining to hear anything beyond the house's own morbid symphony. Then came the dreams, vivid, unsettling. I was always walking down a long, sterile stretch of carpet, a sickly fluorescent light humming overhead. The walls were a pale, peeling beige. On either side, an endless procession of doors, all identical, all a dull, unvarnished wood. If I stopped, if I dared to open one of those doors, something terrible would happen. Air in the dream was thick, stagnant, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and sour. I'd wake up with my sheets damp, my heart racing, the phantom echo of that sterile corridor clinging to me. During the day, the house offered subtle torments. I'd leave a book on the bedside table, only to find it later on the floor, pages splayed open to a random, meaningless passage. A cup of tea, left cooling on the kitchen counter, would be found overturned, its contents staining the warped wood. Small things, easily dismissed as my own carelessness, my growing anxiety. But the feeling that these were not accidents, that a deliberate hand was at play, was growing stronger. It was a gnawing unease that settled deep in my gut, a persistent hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. The door was plain, unadorned, and the lock looked old, rusted. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need to understand, compelled me. I searched my pockets, found a sturdy metal letter opener from the library. It took several tries, the metal groaning in protest, but eventually the tumblers yielded with a sharp click. The room was small, bare, save for a single tarnished silver hand mirror lying on the dusty floor. I picked it up. The glass was clouded, distorted. As I wiped away the grime, my own reflection slowly came into focus. But it wasn't quite right. A tremor ran through my hand. I spun around. Just the empty room, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy window. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection was smiling, a slow, unsettling grin that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were not quite my own. They were too sharp. My breath hitched. It was my face, yet it was wrong, profoundly wrong. The reflection's eyes, my eyes, held a glint of something ancient and malevolent. I dropped the mirror with a clatter. It landed on the floor. Still facing me, my distorted reflection staring up, that terrible smile fixed in place. I backed away slowly, my gaze locked on the glass. The smile didn't waver. It seemed to deepen, to consume the face. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the lock, trying to secure it again. But the image was seared into my mind. That smile, that wrongness. I tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, stress, sheer age of the place playing tricks on my mind. But the lingering scent of that sweet, rotten air, the memory of those sharp teeth, felt too real. For a fleeting second, I saw it again. The unnerving grin. I flinched and my normal face returned. But the doubt had taken root. Was I truly alone in this house, or was something else wearing my face, waiting for its moment? The house seemed to exhale around me, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The identical doors from my dreams flashed in my mind's eye. What lay behind them, and more importantly, what was trying to get out? The tapping stopped, or perhaps it had never begun. My mind, already a fog of sleepless nights and the cloying scent of old books, was playing tricks. I told myself that it had to be that. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than the sound, pressing against my eardrums. I strained to hear anything, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind through a broken pane, but there was only the blood thrumming in my own ears. I left the library, the heavy oak door groaning shut behind me like a sigh. The grand staircase, usually a stark silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows, seemed to writhe. I shook my head, trying to clear it. This place, it was getting to me. I needed to get out, to see the sun, to hear the mundane chatter of people who didn't live in perpetual twilight. My phone. I'd forgotten about my phone. I'd left it charging upstairs in my room, a small, insignificant object, but it was my tether to the world beyond these decaying walls. I climbed the stairs, each step a reluctant protest under my weight. My room was just as I'd left it, a pocket of relative normalcy in this suffocating expanse. The phone was on the bedside table, its screen a bright, welcoming beacon. I picked it up, my fingers fumbling slightly. Signal 2 bars. A small victory. I scrolled through my missed calls, my messages, nothing urgent, just the usual from my sister asking if I was settling in. The irony was a bitter pill. I opened my browser, intending to look up local news, anything to remind me of the world outside this mausoleum. Instead, my fingers, guided by some unseen impulse, typed in the name of the house. The estate agent's listing. I'd barely glanced at it before, too eager to get here to claim my inheritance. Now I read it with a different kind of attention. Blackwood Manor, a property steeped in history awaiting its next custodian. History, that was an understatement. It felt less like history and more like a tomb, breathing its last stale air. I scrolled down, past the hyperbolic descriptions of architectural grandeur, the vague mentions of unique features. Then I saw it, a small, almost overlooked paragraph near the bottom. The property is subject to certain covenants. The late owner, Mr. Silas Blackwood, stipulated that the inheritor must reside within the manor for a period of no less than 1 year, undisturbed, to fully claim the estate's considerable assets. Further details are contained within the supplemental documentation, available upon request from the executor. Undisturbed. What did that even mean? And supplemental documentation? I hadn't seen any. The lawyer had given me the keys, a thick folder of papers, and a curt nod. I looked around the room, the familiar objects suddenly alien. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were tracing my movements. I needed to find that supplemental documentation. It was in the library, I remembered. But the thought of returning sent a tremor of apprehension through me. The tapping, the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to stand. I would not be cowed by an old house. This was my inheritance, my chance. I had to understand. I had to know what Silas Blackwood had intended. The journey back down the stairs was even more nerve-wracking. The house seemed to groan around me, a symphony of settling timbers and phantom breezes. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate, faded patterns of the Persian rug, refusing to look at the portraits that lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow me. The library door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. I scanned the room again, more methodically this time. The desk. Silas Blackwood's desk. It was large, imposing, covered in a fine layer of dust. I ran my hand over its surface. The wood surprisingly smooth beneath the grime. I opened the drawers. The first few were empty, save for a scattering of dried inkwells and brittle quills. The third drawer, however, was locked. I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration, a welcome distraction from the gnawing fear, began to set in. I searched the desk's surface under loose papers for a key. Nothing. Then I noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible scratch on the wood near the lock. It wasn't random. It was a symbol, a stylized spiral. I'd seen it before. On the spine of one of the older books, a leather-bound tome I'd dismissed as a ledger. My heart gave a peculiar lurch. I walked over to the bookshelf, my steps unnervingly quiet on the thick carpet. I pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Opening it, I was met with a flurry of brittle pages. Not a ledger, not a diary. It was filled with strange diagrams, intricate patterns, and dense, handwritten script that was almost illegible. It looked like some kind of arcane text, a grimoire. But as I flipped through, a loose sheet of paper, folded and tucked deep within the pages, slipped out. It was a single page, written in a more modern hand, but the ink was faded. It detailed a series of instructions, not for accessing wealth, but for navigating the house. It spoke of specific times, certain doors, and a place called the Threshold. There was mention of offerings and appeasement. It ended abruptly, the writing trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I looked back at the single page, at the cryptic instructions. Was this what Silas Blackwood wanted me to find? Was this the key to the inheritance? Or the key to something far more dangerous? And then, a new sound, faint at first but growing, a rhythmic metallic scraping. It was coming from behind the wall, from within the house itself. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and a deep, primal instinct screamed at me that I never wanted to hear it again. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting to the door, then back to the unsettling text. What was this place? What had I inherited? Was there a way out of this labyrinth, or was this just the beginning of the maze? The scraping intensified, a grating sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my bones. It was close, too close. My hand flew to my chest, my fingers brushing against my racing heart. I had to get out. But where could I go? My gaze fell upon the spiral symbol on the book, then to the corresponding scratch on the desk. Was this symbol a warning or a guide? And if it was a guide, to what? To the wealth, or to the source of that horrifying sound? I stumbled backward, my eyes wide, scanning the walls for an escape, a hidden door, anything. The lawyer's words, undisturbed, clung to me like the damp rot that permeated the air in the mansion. I stood in the middle of my cavernous bedroom, the single grimy window offering a sliver of bruised twilight, supplemental documentation. I hadn't seen any. The lawyer, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a grimace of mild indigestion, had simply handed me the keys, a thick folder of papers, and a curt nod. A sudden chill, unrelated to the ambient temperature of this decaying mausoleum, snaked down my spine. I looked around my room. The four-poster bed, draped in tattered velvet, seemed to sag under an unseen weight. The wallpaper, a once grand floral pattern, now peeled in leprous strips, revealing the dark, sweating plaster beneath. My phone. I fumbled for it, the smooth glass cool against my clammy palm. No signal, not a single bar. I'd noticed it earlier, the dead zone that seemed to swallow any attempt at communication. The mansion was a fortress, a gilded cage. The cryptic will, the promise of immense wealth, it was all a lure, a trap. But who set it and why? I walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool, grimy pane. The grounds outside were a tangled, overgrown mess, the ancient trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. No sign of life, no other buildings, just me and this hulking, breathing thing. A faint scratching sound, it came from the wall behind the bed. I froze, straining my ears. The sound was soft, insistent, like tiny claws on plaster. Rats, I told myself, old houses have rats, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I needed to get out. Even if it meant walking miles back to the nearest town, I couldn't stay another night in this suffocating quiet. I grabbed my jacket, the worn leather smelling faintly of old smoke and something else, something acrid and unpleasant I couldn't quite place. As I reached for the doorknob, a low groan echoed from the hallway, not the settling of old timbers. This was deeper, more resonant, like a suppressed sob. My hand recoiled from the doorknob as if it had burned me. The sound came again, a slow, mournful exhalation that seemed to seep from the very walls. It was a sound of immense, ancient sorrow. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. Was I imagining it? But the scratching started again, this time from the ceiling, directly above me. A frantic, desperate scrabbling. I looked up, my heart racing with a dull, insistent thud. The ornate plasterwork, cracked and discolored, seemed to ripple. This wasn't just an old house. It was alive, was aware, and it was watching me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the leg of the heavy oak dresser. I landed on the rough, dusty floorboards with a grunt. The groaning ceased. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to see. I needed proof. I needed to understand. I crept towards the door, my movements slow and deliberate. I had to know what was out there, what was making those sounds. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob again. This time, there was no hesitation. I twisted it. The door swung inward with a protesting shriek of hinges, revealing not the dimly lit hallway I expected, but a blinding, sterile white light. I blinked, shielding my eyes. The air, which had been thick with the scent of decay, was now sharp and clean, smelling faintly of disinfectant. I stepped cautiously into the light, my eyes adjusting. I was in a corridor, a long, impossibly long corridor, stretching into infinity in both directions. The walls were a uniform, unblemished white. The floor, a polished linoleum that gleamed under the incessant light, and the doors, identical matte gray doors spaced at precise, unnerving intervals. They lined both sides of the corridor, disappearing into the distance. There were no windows, no signs, no variations, just endless repetition. This was not the mansion. This was something else entirely. My gaze swept over the doors. Which one was mine? Which one led back? Or was there a back? A wave of nausea washed over me, but there was only another identical gray door. My breath hitched. I was trapped, not in the mansion but in this place, this endless, sterile purgatory. I took a tentative step forward. I looked at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. The scratching sound, it was back, faint but undeniable. It wasn't coming from the walls of the mansion. It was coming from behind one of these doors. Which one? My eyes scanned the impassive gray surfaces, searching for any clue, any imperfection. But there was nothing. Just the relentless, maddening sameness, and the scratching growing louder, more desperate. Was it trying to get out, or was it trying to get to me? The silence in the mansion had become a physical weight, pressing in on my eardrums. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active silence, as if the very air had been siphoned out to suffocate any potential noise. The silence was a predator, and I was its prey. I remembered the lawyer's dismissive wave when I'd pressed him about supplemental documentation. All accounted for, Mr. Raj. The estate is clear. Clear, the word tasted like ash. Nothing about this place felt clear, it felt deliberate. My search for those missing papers had been fruitless. Every drawer, every cabinet, every dusty tome on the shelves had yielded nothing but cobwebs and the faint, cloying scent of decay. But I knew they were here. The will mentioned them. A contingency, perhaps, something I was meant to find. It carried with it the faint, metallic tang that I'd started to associate with the house itself. It wasn't the smell of rust, not exactly. It was sharper, more primal. I had to get out. But the doors, all of them felt wrong, heavy, as if sealed by an unseen force. I tried the front door again. The massive oak, carved with unsettling, serpentine patterns, refused to budge. I pushed, my shoulders straining, the wood groaning in protest, but it was like pushing against solid rock. Frustration, hot and sharp, flared within me. I kicked the base of the door, a futile gesture that only sent a jarring vibration up my leg. Then a flicker. In the dusty mirror hanging opposite the hall, a movement. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just my own pale, strained reflection staring back. But I'd seen it. I backed away, my eyes darting around the hall. The portraits on the walls, their subjects long dead, seemed to watch me, their painted eyes following my every move. Their smiles, fixed and unnerving, felt like a mockery. I needed proof, something tangible. The will, the cryptic clause about the heir's true inheritance, it all pointed to something hidden, something the house didn't want me to find. My mind raced, cataloging the rooms I'd explored, the hidden alcoves I'd discovered. There had to be a secret passage, a concealed compartment. The architecture was too complex, too deliberately labyrinthine, to be purely for aesthetic purposes. I found myself in the library, a room that always felt heavier than the others. The scent of old paper and dust was thick here, almost suffocating. Rows upon rows of leather-bound books, their spines cracked and faded, lined the walls. I ran my fingers along them, the rough texture of the bindings scratching my skin. Most of them were treatises on obscure subjects, forgotten histories, and philosophical ramblings. Nothing that looked like a journal or a ledger. A particular volume caught my eye. It was tucked away on a high shelf out of reach. Reaching up, I pulled the book free. It was surprisingly heavy, its pages brittle and yellowed. The script was elegant, spidery, and utterly alien. I couldn't decipher a single word, but there were illustrations, crude, unsettling drawings of figures, twisted, contorted shapes that seemed to writhe on the page, and symbols. Symbols that resonated with a deep, primal fear within me, a fear I couldn't name. This was it. This had to be it. The supplemental documentation. But what did it mean? Who had written this? And why was it hidden? A low creak echoed from the hallway. My head snapped up. The sound was distinct, deliberate, not the random settling of an old house. It was the sound of a footstep. My breath hitched. I was alone. I had to be alone. Yet the sound was undeniable. It was slow, measured, coming from the direction of the grand hall. I clutched the strange book to my chest, my grip tight. The creaking stopped. There was the house playing tricks on me, amplifying my fear, twisting my perceptions. Or was something else here, something that had been here all along, waiting for me? I held my breath, straining to hear anything at all. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Then a faint, almost imperceptible scratching began, coming from the other side of the library door. It was rhythmic, insistent, like fingernails on wood. What was on the other side, and why did it sound so patient? The silence was a predator. It stalked the edges of my hearing, and when I dared to listen, it lunged. I tried to hum, a tuneless, reedy sound, but the air seemed to swallow it, leaving only the dry rasp of my own throat. Raj, that's me, I'm Raj. I'm supposed to be here, the will, the wealth. It felt like a cruel joke now, the promise of riches buried beneath layers of suffocating quiet. I'd been here a week, maybe two. Time warped in this place, stretching and snapping like old elastic. My footsteps on the warped floorboards of the mansion were too loud, each creak a betrayal. I'd started leaving the main hall, venturing into the smaller rooms. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, the only movement in this petrified world. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic like old pennies left in the rain. I found myself drawn to the west wing, a section of the house that felt colder, even on the warmest afternoons. The wallpaper here, a faded floral pattern, peeled in long, curling strips, revealing the dark, aged plaster beneath. It looked like flayed skin. I ran a hesitant finger over a particularly ragged edge. The plaster felt strangely yielding, almost damp, despite the dry air elsewhere. A shiver traced its way up my spine. My reflection in a tarnished mirror caught my eye, gaunt. I didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked hunted. I turned away quickly, my breath catching in my chest. One afternoon, while tracing the intricate carvings on a heavy oak door at the end of a particularly long, dim hallway, I heard it. So faint, I almost dismissed it as the wind. But there was no wind. The windows were sealed shut, painted over years ago. It came again, a sibilant hiss that seemed to coil around my thoughts. It wasn't a word, not exactly, more like a sound dredged from the deepest part of a sleeping throat. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses make noises. But this was different. It felt, directed, like a secret being shared just out of my reach. I pressed my ear to the wood, and then a single clear word cutting through the static, Raj. I recoiled as if struck, my name spoken by the house. My resolve, which had been hardening with each passing day, began to crack. I backed away, my eyes darting around the hallway. I needed to leave. I turned and ran, my boots thudding on the floor, but the hallway stretched. Impossibly long. It was like being trapped in a photograph, a single, endless frame. I was in the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. Except this wasn't a hotel. This was my inheritance. This was my prison. It wasn't menacing, not overtly. It was insidious, a siren song promising solace, promising answers. But I knew with a primal certainty that the answers this place offered would be the ones that broke me. I stumbled, my hand slapping against one of the doors. It swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo the sound of my own fear. A faint light flickered within. Curiosity, a dangerous, unwelcome guest, tugged at me. What was behind that door? My breath hitched. I could smell it now, a cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left to rot. And beneath that, the metallic tang, stronger here. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to find the main door, to burst out into the sun and never look back. But the house had a way of wearing down resistance. It was a slow erosion, a constant, subtle pressure. Come in. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorframe. The wood felt slick, unnervingly smooth. I pushed the door open further. The room beyond was a disorienting space. The walls seemed to shift, the colors bleeding into one another. I saw fleeting images, the mocking faces of my childhood bullies, the disappointed frown of my father, the empty chair at my mother's funeral. They flickered like faulty projections, fragments of my past dredged up and replayed for my torment. They spoke of my failures, my regrets, my deepest, most buried fears. They knew me, they knew everything, and they were offering me a place to stay, a place to belong. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the room had settled. It was a small, sparsely furnished chamber. In the center, on a low, dust-covered table, lay a single object. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box. The same carvings as the door, but smaller, more detailed. And on its lid, etched into the wood, was my name, Raj. What was inside? Was this the heart of the house? And if I opened it, could I ever close it again? The air in the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, was thick, heavy with a scent I couldn't quite place. It was metallic, like old pennies, but with an undercurrent of something cloying, like overripe fruit left to rot. My breath hitched. Each door was a perfect, unnerving replica of the last, their brass doorknobs gleaming dully under the weak, flickering light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I ran a hand over my face, the skin clammy. This wasn't right, this was wrong. I remembered the study, the heavy oak desk, the glint of the key, then the shift, a sickening lurch like falling without moving, and now this endless, oppressive hallway. My grip tightened on the heavy iron poker I'd found near the fireplace back at the manor. It felt cold, solid, a welcome anchor in this disorienting expanse. The will, the wealth. It was all a lie, wasn't it? A trap. Blackwood Manor hadn't just been a house. It had been a cage, and I, its latest occupant, its latest meal. I took a step, then another. The carpet beneath my feet was a faded, indeterminate gray, worn threadbare in places. I imagined what lay behind them. Not rooms, not apartments, but fragments of my own nightmares waiting. A faint sound like a sigh drifted from somewhere ahead. It was soft, barely perceptible, but it sent a tremor through me. It was the sound of something ancient, something weary and something hungry. My knuckles were white where I gripped the poker. Determination, a fragile flame, flickered within me. I wouldn't succumb, not here, not in this mockery of a place. I picked a door at random, my heart racing like a trapped bird. The doorknob turned with a soft click. I braced myself, pulled it open, and stepped through. It wasn't a room. It was a space that defied logic. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin. Below me, I could see the faint, swirling patterns of nebulae, impossibly vast. A voice, not spoken aloud but resonating directly in my mind, slithered into my thoughts. I thought I could escape. I thought the game was over. I stumbled back, boots scraping against something that felt like loose gravel. My eyes darted around, trying to find a solid surface, a point of reference. There was none, only the endless drop and the silent, watching stars. This is my legacy, my inheritance. My inheritance was this cosmic horror, this suffocating emptiness. I opened the door. I invited me in. I thought of the will, the cryptic words that had drawn me here. To my dearest heir, I bequeath all that I possess, and all that possesses me. I had dismissed the second part as florid prose, fool. I had been so eager for the wealth, so blind to the true cost. I am mine now, Raj. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the feel of the poker in my hand. Its weight was real. The cold metal was real. This was real. The entity was real, but so was I. I feed on fear, I said, my voice gaining strength. On loneliness, on doubt. And I am so full of them. A faint light bloomed in the blackness before me, not the harsh glare of the stars, but a soft, flickering luminescence. It drew my gaze, a moth to a flame. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it coalescing, taking shape indistinct at first, then sharpening into focus. Its face was a blur of shifting features, yet I felt an unnerving familiarity. It was a composite of all the anxieties I had ever harbored, given form. There is no struggle here, only peace. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't entirely from fear. It was the tremor of adrenaline, the raw energy of survival. This entity had thrived on it. The stars above flared, and the humming intensified, now a dissonant shriek that scraped at my sanity. But I remembered the study, the hidden passage behind the bookshelf, the escape route I had discovered in my desperate search for answers, a route that led not outside, but deeper into the manor's core. It was a gamble, a desperate last-ditch maneuver. I felt a tearing sensation, as if my very being was being ripped apart. The shrieking intensified, laced with a guttural roar of rage. Then a sudden, jarring impact. My head struck something hard and the world went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the manor. But it was different. The air was still, heavy with an unnatural quiet. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight that pierced the gloom of the grand hall. The poker lay beside me, its cold metal a comforting weight against my palm. The entity was gone, or was it? Expectant. I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching. I had survived the climax, but had I truly won, or had I merely retreated, wounded into the heart of my enemy's domain? The air tasted like dust and something else. Something metallic, like old pennies left to sweat in a damp palm. My lungs burned with each shallow breath. I was on my hands and knees, the rough carpet scratching at my skin. It was a sickly, faded floral pattern, the kind that seemed to apologize for its own existence. Above me, a low hum vibrated through the ceiling, a persistent, unseen tremor. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, sluggish, as if wading through tar. I looked around. The wallpaper was a sickly green, peeling at the seams like sunburnt skin. The light, what little there was, filtered through a grimy window, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe. I was in a room that felt wrong, too small yet suffocating, too quiet yet filled with a pressure that pressed against my eardrums. My heart hammered, a dull, insistent thud against my ribs. Then I saw the doors. They lined the walls, a monotonous, unbroken row, identical, a dark, polished wood, each with a brass doorknob that gleamed dully. I counted them. 10 on this side, 10 on the opposite, and more, stretching into the dimness at either end. A hotel corridor, but no reception desk, no luggage carts, no sign of life, only the endless procession of doors, floor 6. The number was etched into the peeling wallpaper above one of the doors, a faded, arrogant gold, the place where it all ended or began again. I remembered the fall, the shriek that tore through me, the feeling of being unmade atom by atom, and then this suffocating, repetitive purgatory. Was this what the house had done? Had it finally consumed me, spitting me out into this waiting room? My hands trembled as I reached for the nearest doorknob. I twisted it, locked, of course. I tried the next and the next. They were all locked, every single one. I started to walk, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the confined space. The hum seemed to grow louder, a resonant frequency that made my teeth ache. I peered at the doors, searching for any difference, any hint of escape, but they were perfect replicas, each one a silent promise of nothing. My reflection in the polished brass of a doorknob startled me. It was me, yet not me. My hair, usually a messy brown, was lank and plastered to my forehead. A ghost, that's what I was. A ghost in this endless hallway. I thought of the house. Blackwood Manor, Raj, my heir, and then it had begun to feed. I remembered the final confrontation. The desperate gamble. Had I escaped? Or had this been the ultimate trick? To survive the manor, only to be trapped in this sterile, echoing prison, forever searching for an exit that didn't exist. A sound, a faint scuffing. It came from further down the corridor. My head snapped up. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears. It was the sound of footsteps. Not mine, hesitant, dragging. I started to walk towards the sound, my pace quickening. The hum seemed to recede, replaced by the growing cadence of those approaching footsteps. Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, flickered within me. Was it another survivor? Someone else the house had ensnared? As I rounded a bend, the corridor stretched out, more doors, more identicality, and there at the far end, a figure, small, hunched. It was moving towards me slowly. My heart pounded. I called out, my voice raspy, unused. Hello? The figure stopped. It didn't turn, it just stopped. Then, a voice, a child's voice, soft, reedy, filled with an ancient sorrow. Are I lost too? I froze. The metallic taste in the air intensified. The child's voice. It was horribly familiar. The voice that had cried out for me when I thought I was alone. The figure began to move again, shuffling closer. I could see it now, a small child, swaddled in what looked like a tattered, gray blanket. It was the same faded floral pattern as the carpet. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The child wasn't lost. The child was home, and I was being invited to join it. Forever. Was this the resolution? Not escape, but assimilation. Had the house finally claimed me, not as a victim, but as a keeper? The child raised a small, pale hand, beckoning. The brass doorknobs seemed to wink in the dim light, each one a silent, mocking promise of an endless loop. What happens when you answer?